Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. It's Ori here. In this video, I'll be taking you through my process for painting this illustration of Hololive's Ayame. I've broken it all down into 6 steps, and I'll be explaining each one in detail. By the end of this video, you'll learn my overall workflow, what I do for each step, and my thought process behind them, as well as key takeaways that you can apply immediately to improve your own art. Let's get started. Step 1. Ideation and pose. I came up with the idea for this piece by first sketching out a few poses while looking at photos for inspiration. When sketching, I like to start with really loose basic drawings first, then erasing lightly with a soft brush and drawing a more refined version on top. I call this leveling up the drawing. So instead of trying to draw an amazing sketch right from the start, I think of it as drawing a really crappy level 0 sketch and then slowly leveling it up by refining it on top. I ended up liking the first pose that I drew and decided to go with a traditional Japanese theme and a kimono for the outfit. I thought the theme would suit Ayame well, and the pose already had the right body proportions for her, so I didn't have to change anything. By the way, my initial idea for this pose actually looks like this. I was planning to do a rabbit theme since 2023 is the year of the rabbit, but I figured it was a bit too late to do a New Year theme piece, so I ended up just changing it to Ayame and focusing more on the Japanese theme. Once I had the pose and general idea down, I started listing out related concepts to help me come up with additional elements to put in the drawing to make it more interesting. I like to use a free app called Notion for this. I always create a note in it whenever I start a new piece, and I essentially use it to plan out the illustration. It's useful to have a place like this where I can write down any thoughts, changes I need to make, and the next steps I need to do while I'm painting. I've put down links to this and everything else I'll be mentioning in the video in the description, so you can go check them out after watching. Since I wasn't very familiar with the topic, I did some research first by reading Wikipedia articles, watching videos on the history behind some of this stuff, and looking at photos on websites like Pinterest. I also looked at works by other artists I admire to see what they included. Some concepts that relate to Ayame are Oni, which means demon, and Onibi, which are her blue whips. For the Japanese theme, there are sakura trees, sliding doors, stone lanterns, and traditional architecture. Related to the kimono are elaborate hair accessories and traditional Japanese patterns. Finally, I thought it would be nice to add a kiseru, which is a traditional smoking pipe that was very common in Japanese society a few hundred years ago, and have the whips come out from there instead of smoke. By the way, I don't always draw poses in this much detail. Usually, I'll start with simpler thumbnail sketches and then refine them, as I did with this Toa illustration. I'll also do a few variations on the pose before deciding on one. Step 2. Character design. After deciding on the pose, I started sketching out the character design as I wanted to create an original outfit. This is just using all normal layers with the liner on top and the color layers below. When it comes to design and originality, I like to think of it as a 80-20 mix between the familiar and the strange. As humans, we're not great at coming up with something completely new, but we're really good at mixing things together to create something unique. For example, taking a horse and putting a horn on it to create a unicorn. Personally, I like to use a ratio of anywhere between 70 to 90% familiar elements and 10 to 30% strange elements. The key idea is to keep things familiar enough so the viewer can understand what it is and relate to it, but with enough strange elements that the piece feels fresh and new. At this stage, I'm just creating a design sketch that's good enough to work from and temporarily deciding how things look. I'll usually figure out the details of the design as I'm drawing, so I can make it suit the composition better. Another reason I did the character design separately like this is because figuring out the design is one problem, and drawing things correctly in perspective is another. Trying to do both at the same time is just too much for my brain to handle, and I also tend to do a better job by focusing on one thing at a time. Anyway, here was my thought process when designing this kimono. First, I tried a long kimono like the ones you normally see. However, it would cover the legs, which I wanted to show in the pose. It also felt like it was too plain to have the kimono cover the shoulders, so I lowered it down. These changes helped introduce strange elements into the familiar kimono, making the viewer feel like they are looking at something new and different. For the patterns, I used a traditional Japanese patterns book recommended by the illustrator Fuzi Choko, who draws really amazing Japanese themed illustrations. Having resource books like this is really useful, but it can be challenging to get your hands on them since some of them aren't available digitally, and Amazon Japan doesn't ship to all countries. I was lucky that a friend could get it for me, but you can make do just fine by using the patterns available for free on the Clip Studio Asset Store. All you need to do is search for Wagara, which means Japanese patterns, and click popular. It will come up with a whole bunch of pretty good designs. I'll put the Japanese kanji text in the video description for you to copy and paste when searching. The key when using pre-made patterns is to not use them as they are, but to change them as necessary to make sure they blend into the piece well. For example, I made sure the white patterns were darker and cooler in color so they didn't stick out too much and distract from the focal areas. By the way, I actually struggled to get the patterns design right, and I ended up not using any of my initial designs since they didn't work in the final. The mistake I did was that I started by thinking how to make this beautiful, flashy design for the kimono, and absolutely ignoring the fact that this piece is really about Ayame and the whips playfully coming out of the pipe and being charmed by her. Visually, I want all the attention to be on the face, chest, hand, and knees area. It's not about the kimono. The kimono is just a supporting actor, and if the extras in the movie stand out too much, they simply distract the viewer from being able to focus on the main characters and enjoying the story. So in hindsight, I definitely should have been clear on what the story and the focal points of the piece was before trying to figure out the details of the design. Because then I would have immediately realized that what the piece really needed was subtlety, not flashiness. And that would have saved me a lot of time from having to fix and change things in the final. So that's definitely a lesson I'm taking with me for next time. Step 3. References. Before refining the sketch further, I usually start by gathering references and putting them into PureRef. If you're drawing on a computer, I highly recommend getting it. It's free and probably the best app for placing your references. I use it all the time. There are two types of references that I usually get: technical and inspirational. The technical references are to help me draw the pose or background. First, I usually like to create the pose in 3D because it's very useful for getting a feel for the overall structure. However, it's obviously not the best reference for anatomy or details. The 3D pose app I use is Doll Atelier because I simply find it the easiest to use. But there are a lot of free alternatives out there, such as the one built right into Clip Studio and on the Asset Store. Then I'll also get some photo references. These are online references of what the pose generally looks like, and I search for them on Pinterest and Google. It can be really hard to find one that matches exactly what you're trying to draw. So I usually also like to take photos of myself doing the pose and also taking a mental note of where each part of the body is in the pose, such as, is the shoulder being raised and is it going more forward than the other shoulder? Is the arm being bent? And how high is the elbow related to the torso? So my method of doing this is to just prop my phone on a stand and taking a video of myself trying out the pose, then screenshotting what will be useful. It definitely feels awkward at first, and if your family or friends see you doing it, they might think you're crazy, especially if you're a guy doing a cute anime girl pose. But just ignore them and lock the door because it's all in the name of creating good art and you'll get used to it. Also, a handy tip for getting references for the background is taking screenshots from YouTube videos of the location. Next are inspirational references. There's two types of this that I get. The first is the I want to draw like this references. Essentially, it's learning from artists further ahead in the journey than us. And the second type is these elements, themes, or motives are really interesting and it might be great to try to include something similar in my own piece references. When it comes to the number of references, it's really up to you. But the most important part is actually studying them. For example, for this piece, as I haven't really drawn kimonos that much, I did a lot of studies to understand their construction and how the wrinkles usually form. Other studies I did were for the specific parts of the pose, such as how the arms would look like, and I also did studies for the elaborate hair accessories. Finally, I also wanted to draw sakura flowers in the foreground, and unlike in the background, they would look really off if I kept them loose. So I did some practice to better understand their form and construction. Step 4. Color rough. Once I've gathered references, I then move on to making the color rough. The color rough is like a blueprint for the final piece. At this stage, you should make most major decisions such as the posing, composition, lighting, and color. Think of it as a close version of the final piece, just without all the details and not so neat. The reason for doing this is because making changes at the rough stage is much faster than trying to make changes later in the process. It also speeds things up by giving you a clear direction of where you are heading with the piece. My process for making the color rough is as follows. 1. I refine the character sketch using references to help me draw. And as I mentioned earlier, I think of refining the sketch as leveling them up, gradually making them more accurate and detailed with each iteration on top. 2. I add in and decide on the color. It's easier to spot mistakes once there's color in the drawing, and it usually takes some experimentation to find the right colors to use. 3. I determine the lighting. Specifically, I note down the number of light sources, the direction where the light is coming from, and the quality of light, which is how strong is it and what color is it. And I actually recommend writing this down and making it clear, as it will help you be consistent with the lighting when you're doing it, and it'll also help you decide what the shadows will look like. And a really quick way to blocking the lighting is by using Multiply. Finally, 4. I work out the background while keeping in mind the lighting. With this piece, since this is fan art, I already have the base colors for the character to work with. Ayame has a lot of red, so I wanted to portray her blue wisps to provide a nice contrast. Since I also wanted to do a traditional Japanese theme, I went with the strong red with blue accents and white as the main colors. Gold rims are also quite common with these traditional Japanese patterns and outfits, so I included that in too. It also works well with the smoking pipe. For the background, I did a nighttime setting because Ayame is an Oni and the pose is quite sexy, so it'll probably look a bit more alluring if it's at night. Also, the warm colors of the kimono and accessories contrast nicely against the cool colors of the night. Composition-wise, the focal points are the face, chest, hands, and knees, and the subfocal point are the whips. I also use the composition to lead the viewer's eye, which goes from the face to the chest, to the hands, then it loops back to the face, goes to the knee, and then up from the fence to the whips, to the roof and moon, then to the foreground sakura, and finally to the bottom whips. When doing the color rough, it's best to have a clear idea of what you're aiming for. Otherwise, it can balloon the time it takes to finish the piece, since you'll be constantly trying out different things and experimenting. Now, I'm going to admit that I didn't actually follow my own advice this time stupidly, because I was a bit of a lazy potato and thought I'll just figure out the background later and just put down some random Japanese themed elements such as a folding screen, tatami mats, a stone lantern, and ooh, it'll look cool to have this Japanese style house on top of the sea, wouldn't it? I kinda want to go back and slap past Ori in the face. Like, it makes no sense. Tatami mats and folding screens go inside the house, but this is clearly outside, and traditional Japanese houses go on land, Ori, not the sea. But future Ori, there is one word that can justify all of this. Isekai fantasy. Ayame was one day hit by a bus where she finds herself reincarnated in another world where anything goes and the indoors is now outdoors and houses are built on water. Yeah, okay, the viewer is definitely not going to get that backstory. And the piece isn't even about that. So in the end, I decided to follow the laws of Earth and change it all in the final, which definitely ended up taking a lot more time than if I had just properly thought it all out in the color rough. Step 5. Line art. After completing the color rough, the next step is doing the line art. The line art is basically a cleaner and more precise version of the drawing from the color rough. But it's not as simple as just tracing over the outline. To keep the lines from looking dull and flat, I make sure to vary the pressure as I draw. I tend to make the silhouette parts thicker and the inner parts thinner, especially with the hair. For things that come forward towards the viewer, like this knee, I also make them a bit thicker. Additionally, for parts that overlap, I make the parts on top thicker so the viewer can tell which one is on top and which one is below. I also include AO, or ambient occlusion, in my line art, which are the really dark shadows that appear in areas where light can't reach, such as when things overlap very closely or pinch together. To make sure that everything is accurate, I make sure to use references and study anything that I'm unfamiliar with to help understand the structure better. I also suggest drawing in guidelines of the underlying structure of anything that you're not sure of to help capture the form more accurately. Step 6. Coloring. After finishing the line art, the next step is to prepare the piece for coloring by separating it into parts. I usually separate the skin, hair, face elements, and then the remaining parts by color. With the parts separated, I'm now ready to start coloring the piece, and essentially just following what I've already laid out in the color rough. For shading, I use the 1-2-3 shadow system, which I won't go into detail here since I've already made a video on it. But basically, I start by defining what is in light and dark with the first shadow. Then I put in the darker shadows through the 1.5, second, and third shadows. My usual shading order is starting from the skin, then eyes, clothes, hair, and props. I painted the skin, hair, and eyes all using normal layers, but for the other parts, I did the shadows first using normal layers, then added in the local colors using Multiply. For more information on the shading system I use, you can go watch the video I've made on it right after this one. When choosing colors for the shadows, a simple rule of thumb is that the shadows tend to be darker, cooler, and slightly more saturated. As I select the shadows here, take a look at how the color picker moves down, which is darker, right, which is more saturated, and the color shifts towards blue, which is cooler. For skin tone, I use light colors between yellowish to pink, and I tend towards pinkish as preference. I then tweak the shadow colors of each part to make them fit in with the base colors better. This is important because you can't just use one shadow color for everything. For example, if you only use a dark cool color, then it'll make the skin shadows too dark and zombie-like, and the red is very dull. So you've got to adjust them properly, such as making sure the shadows for the skin are warm enough. By the way, a common mistake I see beginners do is making the shadows too light, so watch out for that and make sure your shadows are dark enough. Then I start rendering in more detail. This includes adding extra lights, textures, highlights, rim lights, reflected lights, and so on. Also, I added in the Kimono patterns, which, as I mentioned, I completely changed from the color rough to a more subtle design. I then fixed up any errors by painting on top on a normal layer. Then I render in the additional elements such as the hair accessories. With the coloring for the character all done, I then start rendering in the background, keeping in mind the perspective and horizon line. Also, as I mentioned earlier, I ended up changing quite a lot of things from the color rough. For the background, I kind of just eyeballed things since the character covers most of the canvas and I was going to keep most of the stuff in the back super loose anyway. For example, the buildings added in some environment light and a bit of glow to help the character blend in with the background better. By the way, I ended up not adding in the extra whips effects in the foreground because after trying it on, I found it was just way too noisy and detracted from the focal points too much. I also add color to my line art at this point. My line art isn't completely black, and what I do is I usually add in a darker version of the color underneath it, and also warm up the skin areas. I do this usually either by normal layers or hard light layers clipped to the line art folder. Finally, for finishing touches, I added in some photo lighting, which helps to further unify the colors of the whole piece together, and also enhance the lighting. Lastly, I added in a tone curve layer to bump up and adjust the contrast. And with that, the piece is complete. Anyway, this was a longer video than usual, so if you're still watching, thank you so much, and leave a bus emoji in the comments below to let me know you made it all the way to the end. Also, you might like to check out these videos. The shading video on the left explains the 1, 2, 3 shading system I talked about, and the hair